According to Fleisher and Krienert, prison culture interprets sexual violence by its context. So depending upon the situation, an act of sexual violence may be interpreted as prison rape. However, in another context, the same act may be viewed as a turnout or be seen as an act of coming out of the closet. Inmate culture then has its own cultural criteria to determine if a sexual encounter is indeed a rape. For example, the authors examine the issue of prison debts, and they, from interviewing their research subjects, contend that if an inmate has unpaid drug or canteen debts, this may increase the risk that he will be vulnerable to acts of sexual or non-sexual victimization. Also, the authors acknowledge that some inmates will simply consent to sex in order to get out of debt. Regardless of how the sex is obtained, the authors acknowledge the fact that a creditor is embarrassed if he fails to collect payments from an inmate. Therefore, it is not uncommon, at the very minimum, for sexual or physical harassment to occur in situations where an inmate falls heavily into debt. Fleisher and Krienert argue that friendships or negative attachments can also increase the risk factor of coerced sex. One respondent informed the authors that the prison recreation yard is often an area where gossip is exchanged. Associating with the wrong individuals can bring trouble upon an inmate, though this often in and of itself may not be sufficient to guarantee harm or victimization. Also, if an inmate is coerced into having sex, prison culture mandates that this individual must retaliate against the assailant. If an inmate gives in to an unwanted sexual overture rather than fight, Fleisher and Krienert argue that other inmates are unlikely to befriend this person since he will undoubtedly be perceived as weak. Interestingly, the authors found that African American Muslim inmates were an exception to this rule. Inmates reported that these inmates will go out of their way to protect weaker prisoners who are also Muslims. Prison gangs, on the other hand, will tend to reject members who are considered weak or unworthy. In a rather interesting twist, Fleisher and Krienert contend that inmates' resistance to homosexual sex weakens over time. Also, based upon the inmate interviews, the authors discuss the possibility that some inmates may actually enjoy aggressive sex. To the outsider, this may very much look like rape. However, the authors explore the possibility that rough sex may permit the inmate to fight back to avoid being labeled a punk, yet at the same time, they posit that this offender will not fight hard enough in order to prevent the sex act from occurring. Fleisher and Krienert argue that by and large, as long as the victim is believed to have fought hard to prevent being raped, this will allow him to restore some, if not eventually all, of his reputation. Again, it is important to emphasize that the authors contend that some inmates may enjoy rough sex, and they might even enjoy getting beaten up while engaging in sex. While they do not fully discuss why this fetish may be popular among some inmates, the authors allude to the fact that when offenders are incarcerated for long periods of time, the sexual desires start to change as a result of their confinement and the power of the situation. So they provide the reader with a sociological rather than a psychological explanation as to why this occurs. In their book, Fleisher and Krienert suggest that some inmates are in touch with their inner homosexual and may be willing to experiment with this, especially if they are sentenced to lengthy prison terms. Turnout artists are inmates who believe that their target is secretly gay and will create elaborate con games in order to make their victims succumb to sexual advances. One strategy that turnout artists use is to put their target in the presence of other openly gay inmates with the hopes that these offenders will show the target how to shave their face, how to arch their eyebrows, change their voice, and walk like a female. In yet another twist, Fleisher and Krienert argue that some of the targets will actually initiate this themselves. In other words, these inmates recognize that there may be tangible rewards associated with being perceived as a female. Therefore, the target will go along with this in order to obtain a desired outcome, such as protection or perhaps monetary compensation or rewards. For example, the authors argue fairly early on in the book that openly gay inmates are actually at the top of the prisoner hierarchy. Given this logic, it is plausible that some inmates may perceive this and allow themselves to actually be turned out in order to accrue both rewards and status within the prison subculture. According to the authors, prison chapels tend to be areas of the correctional facility where homosexual encounters are likely to occur. There tends to be little supervision and many blind spots in prison chapels. Also, staff cannot prevent inmates from attending chapel services. Fleisher and Krienert assert that inmates will be, for the most part, safe if they follow the unwritten rules of inmate social life. In fact, they even contend that prison life for many inmates represents a period of stability and calmness, which may be especially true for female prisoners who are often notorious for having been victims of sexual and physical abuse in the free world. Even though prison does tend to be a safe place for inmates if they follow the rules, this is not to say that inmates do not take certain precautions. For instance, Fleisher and Krienert maintain that some inmates will attempt to become close to correctional employees as a strategy to keep themselves safe during their prison stints. They must also learn to recognize and avoid potentially risky behaviors. Smart inmates learn rather quickly, for example, that it is best to keep to oneself. Also, it is no coincidence that inmates spend hours working out. A bodybuilder's physique may offer protection, as predators prefer an easy target. Also, the authors argue that some inmates will develop a religious hustle in order to lessen the probabilities of being assaulted. For example, if an inmate identifies himself as a strong Christian and carries a Bible with him, there is a strong likelihood that this offender will not be openly mocked, bullied, or picked on. Also, as mentioned earlier, if an inmate becomes a member of the Black Muslims, there is a strong likelihood that the members of this prison religious group will go to great measures to protect one another, even those inmates who are perceived to be weak. While female inmates are known for establishing pseudo-families, Fleisher and Krienert contend that male inmates also engage in fictive family formation in order to ease the pains of imprisonment. For example, some inmates pair up as fathers and sons. When this arrangement occurs, typically the older inmate will school the younger inmate and acquaint him with the prison subculture. This relationship does not necessarily have to be sexual in nature, though it certainly can lead to this, according to Fleisher and Krienert. Inmates may also pair up as husbands and wives. This arrangement often is sexual in nature, and the inmate who is designed to be the wife will often cook meals and wash the clothes of the inmate who is designated to be the husband. If a husband-wife arrangement evolves into a long-term relationship, it is likely to be marked by violence. In fact, Fleisher and Krienert contend that the longer the couple stays together, the more likely it is that violence will occur. In the initial dating stages, violence is very unlikely, but when an inmate considers another inmate to be his wife, or in inmate terms, his property, this raises the possibility that an act of domestic violence or even rape can occur. The authors also discuss officer-inmate inappropriate relationships. They argue that over time, honest officers have a sense of which of their co-workers are dirty, and they tend to drift away from these individuals. Both male and female inmates have inappropriate relationships with prison staff members, according to the authors. Fleisher and Krienert also contend that male inmates are particularly likely to initiate inappropriate relationships with female correctional employees. Interestingly, this finding is consistent with a fairly recent study titled Guards as Embezzlers, in which a colleague and I managed to publish this in the Journal of Deviant Behavior. And in this study, we interviewed 32 inmates who had been disciplined for having an inappropriate relationship with a staff member. And we essentially came to the conclusion that some inmates are very adept at identifying vulnerable officers or those officers with what Donald Cressy refers to as non-shareable problems in his classic study of embezzlers. We found that if inmates perceived that prison staff had financial, relationship, or job-related problems, as well as other problems for that matter, then this made the correctional employees more likely to be targeted by an inmate manipulator. What makes this article unique is that my colleague and I, we take the position that staff members are in many ways the victims in these sort of situations. They are, for lack of a better phrase, damaged individuals that the inmate population is able to identify and target. Of course, in the eyes of the law, a correctional officer cannot be a victim unless it can be established that the inmate raped this individual using brutal force. But if an officer consents, even if it is under duress or due in part to the manipulation or charm of the prisoner, it is the officer who, at least from a legal standpoint, is the one who committed the crime, which may be a rape or sexual assault depending upon the state where this is committed. In virtually all cases, even when it is clear that the inmate initiated and even blackmailed or manipulated or charmed a staff member into having a sexual relationship, it is the inmate who is considered to be the victim in the eyes of the law. Some inmates have even attempted to sue correctional agencies in a civil court in order to seek remedies for sexual relationships that they themselves initiated with staff members.